For over 30 years, a man wrote letters to the police and to the news media describing, in chilling detail, his offenses and how he targeted his victims. He gave himself a name, a signature, a brand almost for his own dark actions. He called himself BTK. Bind, control, kill, and for 3 decades he lived completely undetected as a church-going family man, a Cub Scout leader, a city compliance officer who spent his days writing up neighbors for overgrown lawns, while carrying, underneath all of it, a secret that would eventually make him one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history. This is the story of Dennis Rader, the BTK offender, a man who didn't just commit unthinkable crimes, but who seemed to need the world to know he'd committed them, and whose arrogance, in the end, was the very thing that brought him down. Wichita, Kansas, in the early 1970s, was the kind of place people imagined when they pictured safe, unremarkable, middle America. Quiet streets, modest homes, the sense that terrible things happen somewhere else, to other people, in other cities. That sense of safety ended on the morning of January 15th, 1974. A teenage boy came home to find his family's house eerily silent. What he discovered inside would haunt the city of Wichita for the next 31 years. His father, mother, and 2 younger siblings had all lost their lives, bound and harmed, inside their own home. There was no obvious motive. Nothing of significant value had been taken. It was, from the very first hours of the investigation, a crime that made no sense to the detectives standing in that house. A few weeks later, the intruder made sure it would make even less sense, and far more terrifying. He called the offices of the Wichita Eagle newspaper, directing them to a mechanical engineering textbook in the city's public library. Inside, hidden between the pages, detectives found a typed letter. In it, the writer described the offenses in specific, verifiable detail. Details only the perpetrator could have known. He wrote about his own compulsions in an eerily detached, almost clinical tone, describing something he called the factor that drove him to commit these acts, comparing himself, chillingly, to notorious figures from history whose names he clearly knew well. He signed the letter with the name he'd chosen for himself, BTK. It was, in the history of American crime, a genuinely unusual move. Most offenders who evade capture do so by staying silent, by leaving as small a footprint as possible. BTK seemed to want the opposite. He wanted credit. He wanted the city of Wichita to know exactly who they were dealing with, even as he made absolutely certain they had no idea who he actually was. Over the next several years, BTK struck again and again. Each time, the pattern was similar. He would target his victims in advance, sometimes for weeks, learning their routines, their schedules, the layout of their homes. He nearly always used the same method, binding his victims before taking their lives, which was where the identity he'd given himself came from directly. And after each offense, he would find some way to insert himself back into the investigation, through a letter, a poem, a package left in a public place, always laced with details designed to prove his authenticity, and always demanding the kind of media attention that most offenders spend their entire lives trying to avoid. By the late 1970s, BTK had claimed at least 7 known victims across the Wichita area. And then, he seemed to stop. For nearly 2 decades, the letters ceased. The city slowly began to exhale. Some detectives assumed BTK had passed away. Others believed he'd been incarcerated for an unrelated offense, sitting anonymously in some prison cell, unaware or unconcerned that the world outside had all but forgotten him. A few, a very small few, refused to believe he was gone at all. They were the ones who turned out to be right. The truth was, BTK hadn't stopped his offenses in the late 1970s at all. He'd simply stopped writing. Investigators would later learn that he claimed at least 2 more victims in the years that followed, crimes that, at the time weren't publicly connected to the earlier letters. Without his signature confessions announcing them, these cases were investigated as isolated, unsolved incidents. And BTK, for the first time in his criminal life, discovered he could take a life without immediately courting the attention that had defined him from the very beginning. For almost 25 years, that's exactly what he did. He built an entirely ordinary life over top of the horror underneath it. Dennis Rader, though no one in Wichita knew his name yet, was, on the surface, about as unremarkable as a person could be. He'd served in the United States Air Force, he'd married, and had 2 children. He worked for years as a compliance officer for the city of Park City, a suburb of Wichita, a job that involved enforcing municipal codes, things like animal control violations and overgrown grass. It was a position that gave him a strange, almost darkly ironic form of authority, the ability to knock on his neighbors' doors, unannounced, under the cover of entirely legitimate civic business. He was also, by every account from people who knew him, deeply embedded in his community. He served as president of his church congregation. He volunteered as a Cub Scout leader. Neighbors described him as a bit rigid, a stickler for rules, occasionally difficult, but nothing that raised any real alarm. He was, in the most unsettling sense possible, hiding in plain sight, inside the very community he continued periodically to terrorize. Then, in 2004, everything changed again. That year marked the 30th anniversary of the original 1974 crimes, and a local Wichita newspaper ran a retrospective piece revisiting the still unsolved case. It seems that anniversary and the renewed attention around it was more than Dennis Rader could resist. And what he did next would finally begin to unravel everything he'd built. That year marked the 30th anniversary of the original 1974 crimes, and a local Wichita newspaper ran a retrospective piece revisiting the still unsolved case. It seems that anniversary and the renewed attention around it was more than Dennis Rader could resist. In March of 2004, after 25 years of silence, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle. Inside was a photocopy of a driver's license belonging to a woman who had lost her life in 1986, a case that had never before been publicly connected to BTK. It was undeniable proof that he was still alive, still watching, and apparently still needed the world to know it. Investigators were stunned and quietly elated. A task force, dormant for decades, was reassembled. And this time, they had something earlier investigators never had access to: modern forensic science, and an offender whose ego, it turned out, was about to become his greatest weakness. Over the following months, BTK resumed his old habit of communication, sending a series of letters, packages, and cryptic puzzles to local media outlets and police, always carefully avoiding anything that could be traced back to him. He seemed, by this point, to be enjoying the game as much as the offenses themselves, treating the reopened investigation almost like a correspondence with old friends, teasing detectives with clues, testing how much attention he could generate without exposing himself. That overconfidence would prove fatal to his anonymity. In one of his communications, BTK asked investigators directly whether a digital storage disk could be traced back to the sender if he used one to communicate. Detectives, seeing an opening, made a decision that would end his 31-year run of freedom. They lied. Publicly, through the media, they stated that the disk could not be traced. BTK believed them. In February of 2005, a purple storage disk arrived, addressed to a Wichita television station. When investigators examined its metadata, they found it had last been saved by someone using a computer at Christ Lutheran Church, and the deleted file information pointed to a user named Dennis. It was the break that cracked the case wide open. Investigators quickly identified Dennis Rader as the president of that very church's congregation council. They obtained a DNA sample from his adult daughter's medical records without her knowledge, and compared it to genetic material recovered from decades-old crime scenes. It was a match, tying Rader directly to the offenses across 3 decades. On February 25th, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested outside his home in Park City, Kansas. A 60-year-old grandfather, a church leader, a city employee who had spent his entire adult life hidden in the most ordinary disguise imaginable, about to be revealed to his family, his congregation, and the entire country as one of the most notorious serial offenders in American history. Through Wichita, unlike anything the city had experienced. Neighbors who had waved to him for years, fellow parishioners who had prayed beside him every Sunday, scouts who had looked up to him as a troop leader. All of them were forced, almost overnight, to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the figure investigators had just pulled out from underneath him. Perhaps no one was more devastated than his own family. His wife of over 3 decades filed for legal separation almost immediately, and by every account, had no knowledge whatsoever of her husband's secret life. His adult children, whose own Dina had unknowingly helped identify him, were left to grapple publicly with a betrayal almost impossible to comprehend. The discovery that the father who raised them had also, across the very same years, been harming and taking the lives of his neighbors. In June of 2005, Dennis Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree offenses. Because Kansas did not have the maximum penalty in effect at the time of his earlier crimes, and because his plea avoided a lengthy trial, he faced life in prison rather than the ultimate legal sanction. What followed in the courtroom was one of the most disturbing pieces of testimony ever delivered in American legal history. As part of his plea, Rader was required to describe, in his own words, exactly what he had done and how. He did so in a flat, methodical, almost administrative tone, the same tone investigators had noted in his letters decades earlier, walking the court through offense after offense with a level of procedural detail that left even hardened investigators visibly unsettled. He spoke about his actions the way another person might describe fixing a piece of machinery. No apparent remorse, no hesitation, just process. That chilling detachment became, for criminologists and psychologists studying the case afterward, one of its most important and disturbing lessons. Rader wasn't chaotic or overtly disturbed in any way that would have made him stand out. He was organized, patient, capable of compartmentalizing his actions so completely that it coexisted for over 30 years alongside a functioning marriage, a career, and a position of trust within his own church. He later described, during interviews with investigators and psychologists, having what he called different factors or personas, a way of separating the ordinary Dennis Rader from the identity underneath. It offered a rare, unsettling window into how a person can build an entire second life around dark compulsions and hide it so completely that even the people closest to him never saw it coming. Rader was ultimately sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, guaranteeing he would spend the remainder of his life in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 175 years. He remains incarcerated today. The BTK case also left a lasting mark on how investigators think about long-dormant serial cases. For 25 years, silence had been mistaken for resolution, an assumption that no news meant the perpetrator was gone, incarcerated elsewhere, or had passed away. Rader's case proved that assumption dangerously wrong. He hadn't stopped because he'd been caught, or because he'd changed. He'd stopped announcing himself and continued his actions anyway, hidden behind an ordinary life that no one thought to question. What ultimately caught him wasn't advanced forensic science, or a lucky tip, or years of relentless pursuit. It was his own need for recognition, the same compulsion that made him sign his letters and mail his packages and reach back out after 25 years of silence, simply because an anniversary article reminded the world he was still out there. In the end, the same impulse that let him terrorize a city for 3 decades. His hunger to be seen, to be known, to make sure his actions were never forgotten was the exact thing that handed detectives his name. Dennis Rader spent 31 years being the most ordinary man in the room. A neighbor, a father, a scout leader, a man who wrote parking tickets and led his congregation in prayer. And underneath all of it, the entire time, was BTK. A reminder that the face of dark intent rarely looks the way we expect it to, and that sometimes it's sitting right next door.